Yeah,
Okay.
I'm sorry about that.
Me too.
Okay, John, go ahead.
Okay, Jon Paris here, and I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I grew up in Shorewood, and then I moved to Kane and Prospect, and went to Shorewood High School, went to UWM, and after Kane and Prospect, I moved to Bradford and Maryland. So Milwaukee is, it's home, even though I've lived in New York for 37 years.
So when did you start playing?
Started playing, I believe it was the summer of '63, that I had a toy bass drum that was about the size of a snare drum, and I used to take my mom's jewelry and put it over the snare drum, and that over the toy bass drum, and it made it sound like a snare drum. And before that, I used to take drumsticks and play newspapers. You know, I just put a bunch of newspapers on the bed or on a chair, and because of the sticks on the newspaper, it sounded like a snare drum. And you know, we had this old lamp in the basement that was like a cymbal almost, so that was the cymbal. And my buddy David Zucker had a guitar, and our other friend Mark Getzinger had a guitar, and we used to jam in Zucker's basement, and I'd play this little fake snare drum, and they'd crank up the guitars, and that was the beginning of the Squires. And eventually I got a drum set. My dad took me to Patty Brothers. He had done some artwork for them. My dad was a commercial artist, and he got a deal on a Kent drum set, and I was thrilled. It was, you know, it was like a real, it wasn't a Ludwig or Rogers, but it was, you know, it made drum sounds. So I actually had a kit, and we got Bob Schlager, and he had a bass and an amp, and Mike Gatz knew a lot of songs, so we got him to sing, and he was a popular kid at school, and we thought, hey, he'll bring the people in, you know, bring the girls, you know. It was all about getting the girls, because in high school, when we went to high school, it was really either or. You know, if you wanted to be popular with the girls, you had to be good at sports, or you had to be in a band. I mean, it's changed now. You have athletes that want to be musicians and musicians that want to be athletes, and you know, it was a different thing in high school for us. And I was horrible at sports, and I just knew I'd never get anywhere. So I was in a band, and it gave me a lot of self-esteem in high school to be able to play in a band.
Now, why drums?
Because I couldn't play guitar then. I wanted to be a guitar player, you know, but you know, there were Mark Getzinger at the time. He could play Memphis by Lonnie Mack, and he could play Hideaway by Freddie King, and David could play some of these tunes, and I just thought, I'll never be able to do this stuff. It was a real, almost, you know, sort of typical Midwest self-deprecating, you know, these guys are really great, and I'll never be able to do this. And I had a good sense of rhythm, and drums came pretty easy to me. I used to go to dances and watch other drummers, and I would sit there and kind of try and, you know, mimic what they were doing, and I sort of got it, you know. And at that time, if you could play a rock beat and a shuffle and a two beat and a slow beat, and you could do a roll, you had a gig, you know. I mean, one of the reasons I quit playing drums was in the late 60s when you had Mitch Mitchell and Ginger Baker and John Bonham and all these guys who grew up listening to Elvin Jones, and you know, these were real musicians. And I thought, that I really won't be able to do. And you know, and I love to sing, and I wanted to be out front singing, and I always thought it was weird, even when Dave Clark came out and he was the singing drummer, I thought, you know, drummers, you know, they shouldn't be the lead singer, you know. I mean, it's kind of a, you know, anything goes now. I mean, you got a guy that's got a good voice, and he's a drummer. Let him sing lead, and you know, whatever. But it just didn't seem right at the time. So I really aspired to be a guitar player, and And Bob Schlager used to leave his bass at my house sometimes, and I'd practice the bass, so I got pretty good at that. And I bought a guitar from Mark Getzinger for, I think it was like $10 for a little cheap harmony guitar, and I could play a few chords. And David Zucker and I tried to write some songs. Once the Beatles came and the British invasion, everybody was trying to write songs. We tried to write some songs. I think we wrote a couple, but they just, they weren't as good as the Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley and Eddie Cochran stuff, Buddy Holly and Freddie King and Bobby Bland and James Brown, all those people that we admired and tried to emulate. That we just weren't even close. So that was all through high school, playing with the Chevelles. And I told you the story before about we were the Squires, and our friend who was David's next door neighbor, Bob Zabatsky, was a couple years older, and he was a mentor, and he also used to sing with us once in a while. It was great. So he used to say, "Hey, you guys, do you know this song?" And he had a huge record collection. He loved rock and roll, and he would say, "This, you guys should do this record, or you should do this tune." So he was a big influence on us. Well, he said, "You guys need band cards if you're going to get some gigs." So we were the Squires. He went down to get the band cards, and on the wall of the printer were like 100 bands called the Squires. So he got the idea to call us the Chevelles, and we went with him. A couple weeks later, we met with him, and he said, "I got your band cards, and here you go." And we opened the box, and what happened to the Squires? He says, "We guys are the Chevelles now." That was it. And all through high school, we were the fabulous Chevelles.
Are those business cards that have the pearl, like blue pearl backgrounds?
Ours didn't, but those were, those were around. I actually made up a card that said the Chevelles, and then, we used the ones Bob had printed. I think they were sort of a fake wood finish with raised letters, if I remember right. But we used those till we used them up, and then I designed a little card. And then we had some other ones done commercially later. There were 3 or 4 versions of Chevelles cards. And, David Zucker actually has compiled a great scrapbook of, he started with the Chevelles, and he's built it into including other Milwaukee bands, You should talk to him at some point about this.
Now, what other Milwaukee bands did you admire at the time?
Well, we were fans of Big Louie and the Renegades. We saw them many times. The Del Reys with the Crampf brothers. Craig Crampf went on to play drums on a lot of hit records. And he had Cherokee Studios with the Robs out in California. And Sam McHugh, I never got to see, but I had the Legends, Sam McHugh and the Legends, I had their records, when I was a kid, but I never got to see them. I always felt kind of, just me personally, felt kind of stuck in a weird generation because, the guys like Robert Zabatsky, who was 2-3 years older than us, he saw a lot of the name 50s acts live, and then, so we were sort of too young to be like with the Beatles, they were like Sam McHugh and Big Louie, those guys were the Beatles' age, roughly. They were, 3, 4, 5 years older than we were. And then in the late 70s, 80s, when you had guys like George Thorogood and Stevie Vaughan and Robert Cray and all those guys, well, I was a little too old for, those guys were a couple years, Stevie Vaughan's he was probably 6 or 8 years younger than me. So, that there was like this no man's land that I always felt kind of stuck in, I was too young to be part of the 50s and too old to be part of the 70s. So, but whatever, that's just my personal frustration, among others. But Sam McHugh was a huge influence around here. the Royal Lancers, Paul Steffen with Doug Tank on guitar. And, you know, Bob Metzger and I were talking about West Dallas music before. That was a hub. I mean, Ralph Hansel and Doug Tank and Ralph Studeman and Romy, those guys, they equipped us to play rock and roll. And Bill Faust Music on the South Side, that, you know, that's started us all. If we needed an amp, we went to West Dallas. If we needed drums, we went to Faust Music. That was, you know, they were very encouraging. And, you know, when Bob Metzger and I put the Ox Band together, Doug Tank got us a deal with Sun in the early 70s with Sun amps, and that we were thrilled. We thought, hey, Hendrix has Sun, you know, Steve Miller I think was using Sun amps at one point, The Who, you know, that we thought, hey, we get these Sun amps, you know, great. We thought we were all set, you know, and we had some great gigs there. We opened for Steve Miller, we opened for 10 Years After, we opened for the Grateful Dead and New Riders. A bunch of great stuff. We opened for Procol Harum at Summerfest. We started playing Summerfest in 70, I think, or 71. And Summerfest had just started in 68 or 9. So we were right there, you know, when that whole thing started.
But that wasn't the Chevelles.
No, this, oh, well, yeah, you know, I sort of jumped about 5 years there. Okay. So after the Chevelles, after we got out of high school, I think that last summer, 66, when I graduated, I started fooling around with bass and guitar, and I used to sub for a band called the Redcoats, and I used to sub for the Destinations with Reed Kaling was another band that I used to fill in on drums or bass or rhythm guitar or whatever. And once high school finished, I'd been jamming with Bob Metzger, who was in the band The Walkers, and the original Walkers was Tom Bonnier, and well, actually before Tom, Bob Turner on drums, and Sam Friedman, and Bob Metzger, and Dick Mann. And once Sam and Dick left, Bob switched to guitar, and I came in on bass. That was my freshman year at college. So that was the first band I played bass in, and we were trying to be a blues band. You know, we were really influenced by the Stones, the Animals, the Yardbirds were a big influence. Them with Van Morrison. You know, we really gravitated toward British blues, and that led us to why rock and roll started at Chet's Records in Chicago, 90 miles away. We can be in Chicago in an hour and a half or 2 hours, and it's all right there. But because of the racial and sociological implications up until the 60s, we didn't, you know, we'd play Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley and really didn't know where it was coming from. It was like from outer space. You know, God, listen to this sound is out of this world, you know. And it took the Stones, 2120 South Michigan, they had that instrumental. I remember going to I think it was my first semester in college. My art class took the train down to the Art Center in Chicago, and I missed the train. And I had two options: go home and try and study, or get the next train to Chicago by myself. I was 18 years old, I think, and you know, I'd been to Chicago many times. I had a cousin there we used to visit. Bob Turner and I took the train to see Joe Morello at one of the Ludwig conventions in Chicago. So I knew Chicago a little bit. So I decided, you know, and back then you could take a train from Milwaukee to Chicago every hour and a half. You know, there was another train. So I took the next train. I went to the Art Institute. I'm looking for my class. I saw a few people hanging around. I took some notes, you know, did a little studying. And then here I am, early afternoon in downtown Chicago, and I see Michigan Avenue. So I start walking south on Michigan Avenue, you know, Well, 2 miles later, roughly, there's 2120 South Michigan Avenue. That's that Stones tune. That's Chess Records. And there it was. And to the best of my memory, it was like a storefront. And all the records were, you know, here's Bo Diddley, here's Chuck Berry, Muddy Waters, you know, Little Walter. They had them on display in the window. And I stood there for a few minutes thinking, gosh, should I knock on the door? I don't know, I'm just a kid from Milwaukee, I don't know, they might get mad at me, they might chase me away, I don't know, maybe I should go in, maybe they need a drummer, maybe I could play on a session or something. And I thought, no, I better get back home. And I left. And, who knows? I mean, maybe Muddy was recording there and I could have watched or something. Or maybe Fleetwood Mac was there doing their Chicago record or whatever. But it's hindsight is 20/20. So once I got into this group with Jerry Harrison and Bob Metzger and Bob Turner and Tom Vonier, the Walkers, that's when Bob and I really started getting into the roots of blues and how this all connected. And I remember playing at Shorewood High School, and in high school, not only was this thing about wanting to get the girls, you either had to be in a band or you had to be an athlete, but there was also this sort of divide that either you were into British invasion rock and roll or you were into rhythm and blues like James Brown and Wilson Pickett and the Temptations, and I loved all of it. And I saw somehow, even early on, I saw how it all connected. When the Yardbirds would do some Motown song and they'd rock it up, or Eric Burdon would sing some R&B standard, and I said, oh, well, that's a Temptations tune, or that's a James Brown tune. And, I saw how it all connected, and a lot of people didn't. A lot of people were really divided, and to me, it was just all great music. And it baffled me. I mean, it still baffles me because, I think it was Charlie Parker that says there's two kinds of music, good and bad. And that's in any genre. There's good country music and bad country music. There's good jazz and bad jazz. It's just music is music. And luckily, my upbringing, my having sung in the choir, having sung in Glee Club, and my parents loved music. They were artists, but my dad had a pretty diverse record collection of classical and pop and stuff. So music was important growing up, and it still is. It's a little heartbreaking to see how disposable it is for a lot of young people, because when you got 20,000 songs in your iPod and you can go bang, 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 you don't spend 20 minutes listening to the same song over and over and over, which we used to do. I mean, I remember when I first moved to New York, I found a Jackie Wilson album for 99 cents that had Higher and Higher on it. And I took it back to my little apartment, and I must have played that 20 times. It was just that groove. It was just, it knocked me out, And
I asked some of your fellow musicians earlier about, did you ever, as a guy that's devoted a lot of your many years in the business to blues, did you ever hear any inklings about Grafton and about Paramount Records?
Not till years later. And Gordy Simons from the Avant-Garde is the guy that really made me aware of it. Years later, I mean, I can't remember exactly when I was in Milwaukee visiting my folks, and I either ran into Gordy or I got a urge to call him, and he invited me over and he showed me pictures of the Wisconsin Chair Factory, right? And I was like, oh, this is unbelievable. Here you got guys like Son House coming from the Delta to record in Grafton, Wisconsin. It was just, since I got into blues really heavily, and it means so much to me as an art form or a style of music. It's just, I often tell people that there's a an album by Kenny Burrell, the great jazz guitar player, called "Blues is the Common Ground," and it's pretty much a jazz album, but just that title, says it all. I mean, blues is the foundation for most American music. It's country, it's even hip hop and rap and definitely jazz. I mean, there are very few successful jazz musicians that can't play blues well. All the greats, Django Reinhardt and Charlie Christian, and all the way through the whole history, the blues was always sort of a foundation. But I lost my train of thought. But we're talking about just this area, Wisconsin. People say, "Oh, you're from Milwaukee." You don't think of it as a blues town. But being so close to Chicago, you would hear it on the radio, and we had shows like Dr. Bop, and O.C. White, and we'd hear that stuff, and also the stereotypical thing. My dad had an old transistor radio, and he used to let me use it, and I remember going to bed at night with the radio under my pillow, listening to Nashville, WLAC, John R. Yeah, I mean, I sort of had to remind myself of that, because for years I used to think about it. What was that show I used to listen to? And then I was reading some old rock and roll history stuff. Oh yeah, John R. WLAC, and and I try and go back and remember. Yeah, it's gone now, but I remember just going nuts over what I was hearing, not knowing what it was really, but it was probably Howlin' Wolf and whatever. And so you would get that, and we could get Chicago radio, so it was big influence. And then Jim Lieben had short stuff, which originally the Unit. I remember seeing the Unit at the Avant-Garde with Jeff Degenhardt and Jim Lieben and Petey Peterson, and I think the drummer was Tom Yoakum at that time. And they were kind of going before Butterfield, I think. At least before Butterfield became famous. They were Milwaukee's blues band. And they were a huge influence. I mean, Jim Lieben is still my yardstick for harmonica players. I mean, I've met a lot of great harmonica players, and I'm always like, this guy's good, but he's not as good as Jim Lieben. Or I used to jam with Sugar Blue in New York, and he was one of the first guys I thought, he's got some stuff that Jim doesn't, but. Very rarely do I hear a guy that impresses me as much as Jim has influenced a lot of us.
Let's move back. You were talking about the Walkers, and you're joining the band, playing with Bob Metzger.
Yeah.
How long did that last, and then where did that?
Well, that lasted through the core of the band. Were seniors in high school. Jerry and Bob Turner and Tom Vonier. Bob was a year younger and I was a year older. So actually a class, I think Bob and I are about a year apart, but that September, October, November thing, you can kind of go one way or the other. But all that aside, I think it was just through that senior year, and then everybody went off to college, and I stayed at UWM, and Bob and I kept playing together in various bands. And we started this group with Bruce Butcher, and Scott Mulligan was our drummer, and we picked the name out of the hat. We were fans of The Who, and there was a song on the Who album, Ox, and that was one of the names. We were thinking about maybe being called Bedlam. There were probably put like a half a dozen names in a hat, and we picked them out, and we picked Ox. The Ox. We didn't find out till years later, I didn't, that the Ox, the song by The Who, The Ox, was named after John Entwistle, the bass player. That was his nickname, The Ox. So we were actually named after John Entwistle and the song by The Who. So and eventually it started out as the Ox with Bruce, and then Bruce sort of left because we were a little more diligent about rehearsing and getting a repertoire together. And Bruce was kind of lackadaisical about stuff, and he'd rather go to Chicago and hear the Jefferson Airplane than practice. And we said, no, this isn't going to work. And it was sad in a way, because we were had tremendous potential. I mean, Bob and Brad and I all sang. We used to do 3-part harmony stuff like the Who and the Byrds, and then Bruce played bass and I could play harmonica, so we could do a Muddy Waters tune. We had the 2 guitars, we could do Beatles stuff. It just had a lot of potential, and it was sort of tragic that Bruce left, but we carried on with just me and Bob and Scott, and that became the Ox, and then eventually we became Ox, and we had Brad Sipe joined the band. He had a double bass kit. We had the O and the X on the double bass. It's kind of a silly name for a band, but it had a great visual thing, and that was the time of Cream and Spirit and those kind of Ox, whatever.
So, and you pulled your repertoire from the sort of the new popular music.
Well, we were continued to be very Yardbirds influenced, very blues influenced, and we would work up arrangements of Muddy Waters tunes or B.B. King tunes or Chuck Berry or Eddie Cochran. We pulled from a lot of styles, and we would find these obscure records. Bob's sister, I think, had been in Europe and brought back some Hendrix stuff, so we did stuff like Stone Free that wasn't even released here yet. And it's stupid that we never recorded some of this stuff. I mean, Summertime Blues was one of our big tunes, and then what was the band? Vincibus Eruptum. Blue Cheer had, that sort of wiped that out for us. And then, I was talking with Bob the other night. I mean, it's really ridiculous that we never made a record. The Chevelles never recorded, the Walkers never recorded, Ox never recorded. We came close, but people were recording. I mean, there's this book out on Wisconsin music filled with bands that made records. And why didn't we record? And Bob and I were starting to write tunes. Brad had these great rhythm things, and we'd come up with these ideas, and we had, a bunch of original stuff, and we should have, but shoulda, coulda, woulda. Hindsight is 20/20. We had this kind of Midwest, well, not only are we not from New York or LA or Nashville, we're not even from Chicago. We're from Milwaukee, I mean, how are we ever going to make it? Even the Robs, who were from here, when people ask, where are you guys from? Oh, we're from Florida. I don't know. But
So how long did Ox last?
well, to the best of my recollection, it was roughly 67, sometime maybe late 67 through 72 maybe. I have the calendars at home somewhere. Gordy Simon asked me about it, and I went through it, and I've got them. If you need the info, I could dig it up if you need the info. But it was a great experience. We opened for Alvin Lee at the auditorium or the arena. Like 10,000 people. And,
That was 10 years after, and Lee Michaels, is that?
Yeah. And, we had some great opportunities. We opened for Melanie at the Oriental Theater. And, but I think what ended the band is Bob really loved some of this new country-ish kind of stuff that was happening, like Polka and the Burrito Brothers, and I see it now. It's really great guitar music. It's very challenging for a guitar player to learn that stuff, and Bob nailed that stuff, and he wanted to go more in that direction, and I wanted to be a blues rock band like Hendrix, like Cream, like Led Zeppelin, like how we started out, but I wanted to refine it and try and come up with our own thing of that style, and that became an eventual leading to Bob joining the Hound Dogs and me wanting to play guitar, which I wanted to play all along, but there were so many good guitar players in Milwaukee. I mean, it was just unbelievable. It was pretty overwhelming. Now they're crawling out of the woodwork all over, But, I mean, you get
So ox ends and you go to...
Well, I went through a few. I almost played drums with Short Stuff. Jim Lieben. Well, this was at the beginning of Ox. Jim had been with A.B. Sky Band, and they had gone to California. And I think Jim actually they got to jam with Hendrix, and they were pretty happy. And Jim left, came back to Milwaukee to start Short Stuff. And he needed a drummer, and I auditioned. He wanted me to play, and we did a couple rehearsals. Eric Epstein on guitar, and he asked me to be in the band. I said, "Well, Bob Metzger and I just started this band. I'm playing bass, and I think I'm probably going to do that." That was early on. But after Ox broke up, there were opportunities like that, and I played with Junior for a while. In his Lieben went to Nashville. After Short Stuff had been around for a while, and Junior kept the band going here, and I played bass with him, and Danny Schmidt, and Tom Fabre's great sax player, and Joe Kelly from the Shadows of Night was the guitar player. Great blues guitar player. And around that time, Mike Kappas and a couple of people and I were all living together. From Kane Place, we had moved to Bradford, and Jim Solberg from Eau Claire had been living at Kane Place, and they had a band called Dynamite Duck, and they needed a guitar player, and so I started playing guitar with them. That was really the first band I actually played guitar in, although I'd subbed with other bands.
So, talk to us about Kane Place. That seems to be a common theme.
That was like it was like this little scene, You had Bob had an apartment. Jim Solberg was living with him. He had come down from Eau Claire, and I was in this apartment with Kappas, and Mark Lillis came down from Eau Claire, and Jeff Hilgert came down from Eau Claire, and so we were all living together, and Kim Jorgensen was living there, and who else? I mean, it was like a little scene, It's interesting. I just was talking with Joe Louis Walker. You familiar with him? Really great blues player. And he was talking about the San Francisco scene, and we were talking about Mike Bloomfield. And apparently Michael's house at one time was like Kane Place was for us. People would come by, and Joe Louis Walker was telling me that, Michael would have like a bluegrass night, and all these bluegrass guys would come over and jam, and then the next night would be R&B night, and they'd all play R&B tunes. The next night would be blues night, everybody would play blues. And, everybody sort of gravitated to Michael's house, and when I think about it, it reminds me of Kane Place, because, people were coming and going, and all these little bands that lived there, and it was right here on the east side. It was a great scene,
Now, what made you decide to go to New York?
Well, I had done this record with Stuffy Schmidt, and we did it here in Milwaukee, and Stuffy's brother Danny played on it, and Brad Sipe played drums on it, and I played bass on a bunch of stuff. Sam Friedman played guitar. I think Bob played on a bunch of the stuff. Steve Wiest played harp. And Stuffy got a deal with Paramount Records and decided to go to New York. And he said, "Why don't you come with me?" And I was thinking to myself, geez, I've played just about every bar and rock club and blues club in Wisconsin at least 5 or 10 or 20 times. Where are we going? And it just seemed like the thing to do. And looking back on it, I thought, well, I'll try this. And Stuffy had found an apartment. He was living there with his girlfriend, and he found an apartment for me in the Village. and it was very, it was serendipitous or whatever, kismet, or I don't know what the word is. But it was meant to be, I guess, because he found this apartment that he and his girlfriend were going to live in. And it was literally one room, big enough for a bed and a desk, with a kitchenette, built into the wall. And the bathroom, when you sat in the toilet, the sink was there, and the tub was like this long. And he and his girlfriend were going to live there together, and they decided to find a little bigger place. So he hooked that apartment up for me.
Was it Sullivan Street?
Yeah, and you were there, right?
Yeah.
I think I visited there too.
And Stuffy and I drove out. He came back to New York to get some things together, and then we drove back came back to Milwaukee from New York, and then he and I drove back to New York together. And I actually stayed with him for a couple of weeks while I fixed up this apartment, because it was a wreck. And I painted it and cleaned it, and finally moved in. And it was perfect. It was 3 blocks from Folk City. It was 2 blocks from the bitter end. It was 6 blocks from the bottom line.
Electric Ladyland too.
Electric Lady was just a few blocks, around the corner. And Stuffy had gotten some demo time at Electric Lady, so he and I did a bunch of demos there. Danny, Stuffy's brother, Danny Schmidt, came to New York, and Stuffy and Danny and I did some gigs together, and we recorded at Electric Lady, and we got to meet Mitch Mitchell at that time, and it was kind of a happening time, and when I think back about it, I wish I'd moved to New York right out of high school, but I might be dead now. I don't know. Who knows? But Stuff was really driven to get his thing together, and he started doing gigs around New York, and we started playing. And then he got to a point where he didn't want to do gigs as much as just try and write tunes. And I love to play, so I started doing solo gigs. I'd never played solo before, but I saw Stuffy do it, and I thought, well, if I get some tunes together, I can start doing this. So, and I had an acoustic guitar that I bought from Doug Tank at West Dallas, and brought it to New York. Beautiful old Gibson, and I started playing harp on a rack and playing blues and rock and roll, and wrote a few tunes. And one night I was playing at the bitter end, which at that time was called the other end. It was Paul Colby's other end. I was playing in the restaurant part,